To this, the first screencast in what will be a series of screencasts about film studies. This will probably not conform to any of the conventions of YouTube vlogging that fans of Zoella et al. Will be familiar with, but what it will do is provide you with a quick run through some of the key ideas and theories that you'll need to have in your heads prior to the exam. Specifically, we're going to be talking today about spectatorship, which is section B. This screencast and the series of screencasts wouldn't exist without the petitioning of my A2 film class, particularly the 2016-2017 film class, and it's this inaugural edition goes with a big shout out to them. The notes for this particular talk have been taken from Patrick Phillips's chapter in Jill Nelm's Introduction to Film Studies, and Patrick Phillips, is the principal examiner for our exam, so it's worth looking at what he says. I've given you photocopies of parts of this chapter already, so all of this material should be very familiar. There will be a couple of bits that might be slightly new, but I'm optimistic that you'll be able to get these as we go along. If you have any problems or any queries about any of this material, then don't hesitate to ask. Okay, so the concept of the difference between audience and spectator is something that we've talked about in class. Audience is a term which we tend to use for audiences as a mass, as a group of people put together. It's not really about the individual. It tends to be something which is used to describe the process before and after the film, particularly things like marketing, how you market a film towards an audience, how you generate an audience for a film. Whereas spectatorship is concerned very much with the individual who's positioned between the projector and the darkened screen as part of that cinema apparatus, the spectator in the singular, and how the spectator generates meaning, how the spectator takes meaning from the film. Spectatorship tries to generalize about how all spectators behave on the basis of a study of an individual spectator, and of course the one consistent truth is that you and I can only know what goes on in our heads. We don't actually know what goes on in anybody else's heads. Okay, so spectatorship is very closely linked to the idea of the look. Now, we've talked a lot about the look with reference to Laura Mulvey, but this idea of the look and how we control the spectator's look is something which dates back to the very beginning of early cinema. And producers needed to control the look from early stages. They wanted to ensure that the meanings intended the film's makers were those taken by the spectator. In other words, that the meanings that the spectator took from the film were the meanings that the producers of the film had intended. This is obviously linked very clearly to commercial aspects of cinema. You need to make sure that the people who are watching your film are taking the meaning that you intend, and certainly if you are going to be able to give the spectator the kind of pleasure that's going to make them pay for watching films, then the odds are that that's going to be a pleasure linked to the preferred reading that you're offering them. So this idea of how does the producer of the text control the spectator's look is something which is embedded in spectatorship right from the start. There are lots of ways in which the producer of a text can control the spectator's look. Think about issues around the use of camera, issues around mise-en-scène, editing, continuity editing, the macro feature elements like narrative, all those many things that we've discussed in class many times. Obviously, increasing emotional impact and controlling the look is directly linked to the way in which spectators are invited to align with characters and to become invested in the emotional dimension of a narrative being played out before them. In other words, you've got to control the way in which people look at the film, the meaning that they take from the film, if you wish to maximize the amount of audience pleasure that they're going to get out of the film. And a lot of that is linked to how we embed with characters. Are we engaged with the characters? Are we linked to the characters? Are we aligned with the characters? If that's true, and if that's effective, then we're much more likely to feel something. And that's the link to pleasure, that we have to feel something in order to get pleasure from it. And obviously, for the producer of the text, pleasure is also about maximizing profit. They need to make us feel something if we're going to pay money to go back and watch similar films again. Or in some cases, of course, watch the same film again. I mean, very successful films can often see uh, audiences coming back, spectators coming back to the cinema again and again and again. And then, of course, there's a whole set of repeat viewing pleasures which we can enjoy through digital streaming services like Netflix, or by buying a DVD and watching it over and over and over again. And there are lots of us have particular favourite films that we come back to. The look and spectatorship has been developed as a central concept in the control of the spectator and is closely linked to theories associated with desire and pleasure, which we've kind of covered. The look is often used by cinema to provide voyeuristic pleasures, the look of the peeping Tom, able to see without being seen. And that's the key point about voyeurism. It's not just the pleasure of looking, but it's the pleasure of looking without being seen. That's the key voyeuristic aspect to it, and that's often linked to a sexual pleasure. The female is often dissected with a close-up into a fetishized object of the male look. So these quotations that you see on the screen are quotes from the chapter in the book that we have been discussing. A fetishized object of the male look. Now, you remember we talked about fetishization. That's a term which Mulvey uses, but it's a term which we have used ourselves to describe the way in which meaning is attributed to particular objects. It's often a term associated with sexual pleasure, but is not exclusively that. And obviously the idea of the male look was further developed by Laura Mulvey in 1975, which we've covered in detail many times in class. We've got lots of other resources on that on Moodle as well. But you can see then that this concept of how we control, how the producers of films control the spectator's look is key to the creation of meaning, is key to the generation of emotional impact, is key to generating profit out of cinema, which is why these theories of how that process takes place are so important. Now, one of the key ways of looking at spectatorship that we've discussed many times is this distinction between the passive spectator and the active spectator. The truth is that probably we are all at different points in our viewing experience passive spectators and active spectators, but you can divide up different ways of looking at spectatorship by using these terms passive and active. Let's have a quick whiz through then. So, one way of viewing the spectator is to regard them as passive. This view reinforces the idea that the spectator cannot or does not resist different ways of viewing. Key theories behind this include, now we talked a bit about Marxism and the Marxist reading of films when we looked, for example, at Vertigo. Hegemony ensures that we see the values of dominant groups as natural and common sense. So hegemony is the process whereby the dominant groups in society maintain their dominance by exerting influence through cultural forms such as films and books and television and newspapers, usually as a vehicle for presenting their particular set of values and their particular perspective as the obvious choice, the natural choice, as common sense. I'm using air quotes on words like natural and common sense because that is just the trick, that in presenting it as the only point of view or the obvious point of view, it's a very effective way of belittling other perspectives and other ideologies. You could think about this in terms of things like the way for some people, slightly misogynistic attitudes towards women are reinforced by this sense, well, that's just natural. Women can't do these things, that's just natural. Women can only give, women are all about childbirth, they're not about leadership because that's just natural. And it's only as society changes and as we question some of those natural, those readings of things as being particularly natural or common sense, that we can then gain enough distance from those ideas to be able to say, well, hang on a second, that's not really true, is it? Why is it that just because women give birth, they can't necessarily do all these other things as well? And that's kind of the point here about the passive spectator, that popular cinema reinforces mainstream values and encourages us all to accept mainstream ideology without encouraging us to challenge and to question and to push further. Another aspect of the passive spectator, of course, is the psychoanalytic model. We've talked about Lacan many times, mirror stage development. Interestingly, this can be used both by the passive spectator group and the active spectator group. The passive spectator arguing that what we're doing is we're just sitting there passively looking for ourselves in the mirror, and like a budgie who's pleased to see themselves in the mirror, we respond in a kind of very predictable way. We see ourselves, we get pleasure, job done. Obviously, it's more sophisticated, more complex, and we'll come back to that when we come on to the active spectator in a second. One thing we haven't talked about in class, and it's in the chapter, so I'm going to fling it into this presentation now, but don't worry too much about it if you can't get your head around it, is this idea that we are passive spectators because of, from a linguistic point of view, language is fixed, is finite. You can come up with other nouns, you can come up with other verbs. A tradoodle is a new design of pen. I've just made up the word tradoodle. If you're writing with a tradoodle, then you are tradoodling. That's the verb. But this, you can't change the very structure of language. In other words, you've got nouns and you've got verbs, and you can't create another word class. By extension, that the mechanics of film and cinema are fixed, they're rigid, we can't change them. You can have slightly different camera angles, but you're going to, the actual grammar of the film isn't going to be changed by you. You can have different angles and you can put things together in a different order, but the actual grammar itself is something which is pretty much fixed. Therefore, meaning is largely fixed, or the process of taking meaning is largely fixed, and our thinking is limited by those boundaries. We can't think outside of those boundaries. Okay, the active spectator. So these theories drive in the opposite direction, that the spectator is actively engaged in the process of creating meaning. We've talked about cognitive theories before, and that's a key part of the active spectator approach. Theories which talk about how our brains try to map the experience of watching film against other experiences, producing a schema, a way of organising information. This might be by looking for similarities in genre, in narrative, in microfeatures. We go, oh, so that's like this one. Oh, I could see a connection with that one. Oh, I've seen this kind of story before. Or, oh, it's this type of film. I'm expecting that sort of thing to happen. Or continuity editing. We talked about, when we looked at French New Wave, about how startling discontinuity editing is. It shakes you up. But the actual fact that you might argue that as an active spectator we're mapping our experience against these kind of schemas. You might also, of course, argue that when you're looking at films as from a point of view of a study of auteur, that the auteur schema or the star schema kind of kicks in, and that you are not just watching one film in isolation, but you're mapping across to other films. This, of course, makes us active spectators. Another very familiar theory linked to active spectators is that the spectator negotiates meaning with the text. We've talked about this many times: reception theory, Stuart Hall, preferred reading, oppositional reading, negotiated reading. You crudely might argue that those people who just plump for the preferred reading every time are taking a passive route, and that the other two, the negotiated stroke oppositional reading, are positions taken by the more active spectator. This is ground we've covered loads in class, and we've looked at different films and we've looked at different responses and talked about how you can, for example, take a film like Jaws and construct a perfectly reasonable oppositional reading on the basis that the film is attempting to encourage us to celebrate the destruction of the monster in a kind of George and the Dragon sort of narrative, and yet the film is really celebrating an environmental intrusion on the part of humans into a natural world of the shark, and that it's the shark who belongs there and who deserves to be there. It's the shark's perfectly legitimate purpose in life to go around eating, because that's how they survive. And for man to come along and try and slaughter the shark is to excuse me, is to subvert the natural order. So it's quite easy to come up with an oppositional reading to one of these films. Again, this comes back to this idea of the active spectator, that we don't just accept the things that we're given. Murray Smith, of course, we've talked about this in lots of detail, about the 3 stages of character engagement: recognition, alignment, and allegiance. But very importantly, we've discussed how audiences or spectators don't necessarily have to go all the way through that process, and that you might argue that as active spectators you cognitively reject questions of allegiance if you don't like some of the characters that you're being invited to feel allegiance with or share allegiance with. There are other theories that we've looked at, of course, that aren't covered in this book, so I've not included them in this short presentation, but we've talked many times about things like Amy Copland's emotional contagion. We've talked about E. Anne Kaplan's Is the Gaze Male, where she critiques Laura Mulvey's approach to male gaze theory. And all of those different theories that we've discussed are worth thinking about and exploring. The key point, of course, is that you should use these theories as they make sense to you